The first grenade round left the rifle with a hollow thump that rattled teeth. It sailed over the coral ridge in a lazy arc, spinning end over end, trailing smoke like a comet. For 2 seconds, the jungle held its breath. Then the bunker exploded. Not the sharp crack of artillery, but a deep, gut-punching roar that sent timber beams cartwheeling into the sky and silenced the Japanese machine gun that had pinned down an entire Marine platoon for 3 hours. When the smoke cleared, the men stared at a rifle in Corporal Danny Mitchell's hands, a standard M1 Garand, with stock still warm, but now fitted with a stubby metal cup on the muzzle and a sight ladder riveted to the barrel. Mitchell worked the bolt, ejecting a spent cartridge that looked nothing like standard ball ammunition. The brass casing was longer, crimped at the mouth, packed with enough powder to hurl a thin projectile 200 yards with enough force to crack reinforced concrete. Across the ridge, a Japanese soldier whispered a phrase that would spread through enemy lines like wildfire over the next 6 months. Zugakatsu Karasha. Skullcracker. They had seen what these rounds did to men caught in bunkers. Bodies compressed by overpressure, helmets crushed like paper, blood vessels ruptured in eyes and ears. But more than the physical destruction, it was a psychological terror that made hardened soldiers abandon fortified positions and flee into the jungle. Because when Americans put grenade rounds in their rifles, nowhere was safe anymore. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. The Pacific War had a bunker problem. From Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Saipan to Peleliu, Japanese forces had perfected the art of fortification. They carved fighting positions into volcanic rock, reinforced them with coconut logs thicker than telephone poles, covered them with coral rubble and camouflage so complete that Marines could walk within 10 feet without spotting the firing ports. These weren't hasty foxholes. They were engineered strong points designed by officers who understood that Japan's industrial capacity could never match American firepower. So every defensive position had to extract maximum cost in blood. The bunkers were layered in depth, mutually supporting, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that turned beaches into killing grounds. Machine guns nested inside with overhead cover thick enough to shrug off mortar rounds. Spider holes connected them in networks that allowed defenders to retreat, reposition, and emerge behind advancing infantry. Flamethrowers could sometimes clear them, but required men to get within 20 yards, close enough to be cut down by supporting positions. Satchel charges worked if you could reach the entrance, but Japanese gunners had perfected the art of holding fire until demolition teams were committed and exposed. Tank support helped, but islands like Peleliu had terrain too broken for armor, with ridges and ravines that channeled Shermans into predetermined kill zones. Artillery could suppress bunkers but rarely destroyed them, and calling fire missions in close quarters risked hitting your own men. By mid-1943, Marine and Army commanders were looking at casualty projections for upcoming operations with growing alarm. Tarawa had cost over 3,000 casualties in 76 hours, many of them killed trying to neutralize bunkers with methods that required suicidal courage and still failed half the time. The solution came not from ordnance labs or think tanks, but from field expedient modifications that soldiers have been attempting since the first desperate days on Guadalcanal. Standard fragmentation grenades could be launched from rifles using blank cartridges and improvised launchers, cup-shaped attachments that fitted over the muzzle and held the grenade in place while propellant gases accelerated it downrange. The concept wasn't new. French and British forces had used rifle grenades extensively in the First World War, and the Germans had refined the technique with their Skyespecher launcher. But the American military had largely abandoned the idea between wars, viewing rifle grenades as specialty weapons of limited utility. When Marines started requesting them desperately in 1942, procurement officers scrambled to develop standardized systems that could be mass-produced and fielded to infantry units that needed bunker-busting capability at ranges beyond hand-throwing distance. The M1 Garand presented unique challenges. Its semi-automatic action and internal magazine meant that firing a rifle grenade required either a special blank cartridge to cycle the action or a bullet trap device to prevent live rounds from striking the grenade. Early attempts used modified fragmentation grenades with stabilizing fins welded to the base, launched by M3 grenade blanks. Cartridges loaded with fast-burning powder that generated sufficient gas pressure to propel the Grenade, but lacked a projectile. The M7 Grenade launcher was standardized in 1943, a simple steel tube that clamped onto muzzle with a rotating collar and featured a spring-loaded spigot that held the Grenade in place until launch. Infantry training incorporated Grenade launching techniques, teaching riflemen to estimate range, adjust for wind, and compensate for the weapon's rainbow trajectory. But the real innovation, the weapon that earned the name Skullcracker, came in early 1944 when ordnance engineers developed purpose-built Grenade rounds specifically designed for bunker destruction. The M9A1 anti-tank rifle Grenade was adapted for use against fortifications, packing a shape-charged warhead capable of penetrating several inches of steel or over a foot of reinforced concrete. Unlike fragmentation grenades that relied on shrapnel, these rounds used focused explosive force, a copper liner that liquefied on detonation and punched through armor or structural materials like a blowtorch through butter. When fired at bunker apertures or thin walls, they created catastrophic overpressure inside enclosed spaces, killing occupants through blast effect even when penetration was incomplete. But the real terror weapon was the M17 fragmentation rifle Grenade, a thin projectile the size of a beer, can filled with composition be explosive and scored wire that fragmented into hundreds of jagged pieces on detonation. It wasn't as powerful as artillery, but it hit with shocking speed and precision. A trained rifleman could put a round through a bunker firing port at 150 yards, and the explosion inside the confined space was devastating. Men caught in the blast were shredded by fragments, their bodies compressed by overpressure that ruptured lungs and burst blood vessels. Survivors described the effect as being hit by an invisible hammer that crushed the air from their chest and left them bleeding from nose, ears, and eyes. The Japanese had never encountered anything like it. American riflemen who could strike fortified positions from beyond grenade-throwing range, without calling artillery or waiting for tank support. Corporal Danny Mitchell learned the M7 launcher at Camp Pendleton in February 1944, during workup training for what the briefing officers called the most heavily fortified target in the Pacific. Nobody told him the island's name. Operational security was tight, but scuttlebutt said it was a coral fortress where Japanese engineers had spent 18 months turning natural caves into concrete-reinforced bunkers connected by tunnels that ran hundreds of yards underground. Mitchell was 21 years old, a furniture maker's son from Asheville, North Carolina, who had joined the Marines after his older brother was killed aboard the USS Arizona. He was a natural rifleman, one of those rare shooters who would call their shots before the bullet struck and adjust instinctively for distance and wind. But marksmanship alone wouldn't clear bunkers, and his platoon sergeant, a Guadalcanal veteran named Kowalski, made sure every man in the squad could launch grenades accurately under pressure. They practiced on mock-ups, wood-frame structures with firing ports and dummy machine guns, learned to judge range by terrain features, and adjust the rifle's grenade sight for elevation. The M7 launcher added weight to muzzle and changed the weapon's balance, making it clumsy for close-quarters work. Procedure required removing the launcher between shots and return the rifle to standard configuration, but experienced men learned shortcuts, keeping the launcher attached and switching between grenade blanks and ball ammunition by feel, identifying cartridges by touch in situations where seconds mattered. Mitchell became proficient enough that Kowalski designated him the squad's primary grenadier, responsible for carrying extra to 9A1 and M17 rounds in a canvas bag slung across his back. Each grenade weighed over a pound, and the bag held 8. Combined with bandoliers of rifle ammunition, water, rations, entrenching tool, and personal gear, he humped nearly 80 pounds across broken terrain in 100-degree heat. They hit the beach on September 15, 1944. Paliliu, a kidney-shaped coral island 6 miles long, its southern end flat and dominated by an airfield, its northern interior a nightmare landscape of jagged limestone ridges that Marines would later call the bloodiest battlefield. The landing was chaos, Amtraks grinding across reef, mortar rounds walking up the beach, machine gun fire from concealed positions ripping through men before they could find cover. Mitchell's squad made it off the beach and pushed inland toward the airfield through scrub vegetation and shell craters, taking fire from bunkers they couldn't see. The Japanese had learned from earlier island battles. Instead of dying in mass banzai charges, they stayed in their fortifications, waited for targets, and made Americans pay for every yard. By nightfall, the airfield was secured, but casualty reports were staggering. Over 200 dead, nearly 1,000 wounded, all for a few hundred yards of coral and sand. And the real fight hadn't started yet. The ridges loomed ahead, a coral fortress that aerial reconnaissance had photographed but never penetrated. Intelligence estimated 300 fortified positions. They were wrong by a factor 5. The Immerbergal Mountains, called the Immerbergal Pocket by planners, but nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge by the men who fought there, contain over 1,500 bunkers, pillboxes, and cave positions connected by tunnels that allowed Japanese troops to disappear and re-emerge like ghosts. Tank guns couldn't elevate high enough to hit ridgetop positions. Artillery bombardment sent shells skipping off coral without penetrating. Flamethrowers worked but required men to climb exposed slopes while enemy fire poured from multiple directions. The ridges were honeycombed with natural caves enlarged by explosives and pickwork, their interiors cool and dry, with ammunition stored in side chambers and water supplies that could sustain defenders for weeks. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had positioned his forces in depth, refusing to contest the beach directly but creating a layered defense that funneled attackers into kill zones where converging fire made movement suicidal. Mitchell's first encounter with the bunker system came on the third day, during a push to secure a coral ridge designated Hill 205 on tactical maps. The approach was a moonscape, cratered by naval gunfire, littered with shattered palm trunks and the bloated bodies of men from the previous assault. The platoon advanced in squad rushes, one element moving while another provided covering fire, leapfrogging toward the ridgeline through heat that radiated from coral rock like an oven. They were 50 yards from the crest when the ridge erupted. Machine gun fire from 3 positions simultaneously, interlocking arcs that caught the lead squad in the open and cut down 6 men in the first burst. The survivors dug for shell holes and coral outcroppings, while bullets chewed the ground around them. Mitchell pressed himself into a crater lip, feeling impacts vibrate through stone, watching geysers of pulverized coral fountain where tracers struck. Kowalski was screaming into the radio, calling for mortar support, but the Japanese positions were dug below the ridge crest where indirect fire couldn't reach them. The platoon was pinned, couldn't advance without being shredded, could withdraw without exposing their backs, couldn't dig deeper into solid coral. They had 2 options: wait for darkness and casualties from heat exhaustion, or neutralize the bunkers. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Garza, crawled to Mitchell's position and pointed toward the nearest machine gun nest, a dark slit in the coral face, about 20 feet below the ridgeline, invisible until muzzle flash gave away its location. "Can you hit that?" Garza shouted over the noise. Mitchell studied the range. Maybe 120 yards, uphill, moving target because the gunner was shifting fire between different sectors. Wind negligible, but heat shimmer, making it hard to judge precise distance. He nodded, pulled the M7 launcher from his pack, and twisted it onto the Garand's muzzle until the collar locked. The grenade sight was a simple ladder with range notches. He estimated 125 yards and set the slider accordingly. The rifle felt alien with the launcher attached, front heavy, muzzle hanging low. Mitchell fished a grenade blank from his ammo pouch, loaded it into the chamber, and thumbed an M17 fragmentation round from the canvas bag. The grenade was heavier than it looked, dense with explosive and scored wire, its base shaped to fit the launcher's spigot. He seated it carefully, feeling the spring-loaded catching gauge, then pressed the stock against coral and sighted on the bunker aperture. The machine gun was still firing, sending long bursts into positions down the line where Marines were pinned. Mitchell waited for a pause, that momentary gap, when gunners swap barrels or reload. When the firing stopped, he rose to a kneeling position, settled the sight picture, and squeezed the trigger. The blank round detonated with a flat crack that was nothing like a standard rifle shot. The recoil felt different, sharper, more abrupt, and the grenade leapt from the launcher with surprising velocity, arcing upward and slightly right in a trajectory that seemed impossibly slow. Mitchell watched it climb apex and descend toward the bunker. It struck coral 6 feet left of the aperture and detonated on impact. The explosion was enormous, a yellow-white flash followed by a pressure wave that slapped the air and sent fragments screaming across the slope. Coral dust geysered from the bunker entrance, and for 3 seconds nothing happened. Then screaming started high-pitched, agonized wailing from inside the fortification. The machine gun stayed silent. Garza was already moving, waving the platoon forward. Go, go, go. Men surged from cover, sprinting up slope while Mitchell loaded another grenade, targeting the second bunker. This time he adjusted left, compensating for the previous round's drift. The grenade flew true, entered the firing port dead center, and exploded inside. The bunker vomited flame and smoke from every opening. Primary aperture, rear entrance, ventilation gap, and a body tumbled out, uniform burning, landing in a motionless heap on the coral apron. The third position stopped firing without being hit. Its crew abandoned their weapon and fled into the tunnel network, preferring to take their chances underground rather than face another grenade round. By the time the platoon reached the ridge crest, Hill 205 was theirs. Cost: 6 dead, 9 wounded, 3 bunkers destroyed, and approximately 15 enemy killed or forced to retreat. Traditional assault methods would have required close-range demolitions, flamethrowers, and possibly tank support. Hours of work and double the casualties. Mitchell's grenade rifle accomplished it in under 10 minutes. Word spread fast. By nightfall, company commanders were requesting additional grenade launchers and ammunition. By the next morning, supply officers were prioritizing rifle grenade shipments over some categories of artillery shells. The weapon was proving itself in the one laboratory that mattered: combat against fortified positions where conventional tactics failed. But the real impact wasn't measured in bunkers destroyed or enemy casualties. It was psychological. Japanese soldiers began reporting to their officers that American riflemen possessed a new weapon, something between a mortar and a grenade, delivered with rifle accuracy but explosive force far beyond hand-thrown munitions. Prisoners interrogated later described the terror of hearing the hollow thump of launch, knowing an explosive was inbound but having no way to track it, no time to react, no defense except fleeing the bunker and exposing yourself to rifle fire. The phrase Zugakatsu Karasha appeared in captured diaries and letters. Skullcracker, a weapon that turned fortifications into death traps and made men question whether concrete and coral offered any protection at all. Mitchell's reputation grew with each engagement. By the end of the first week, he had destroyed 11 bunkers and damaged or suppressed at least 20 more. Other grenadiers and battalion were tallying similar numbers, but Mitchell developed techniques that increased effectiveness and survivability. He learned to fire from defilade, using terrain to mask his position until the moment of launch, then immediately relocating before enemy observers could call mortar fire or direct machine gun counterfire. He discovered that the M9A1-shaped charge rounds, designed for anti-tank work, were devastatingly effective against reinforced bunkers, the penetrating jet punching through coconut log overhead cover and detonating inside with blast effects that killed everyone in the space. He experimented with firing sequences, putting a fragmentation round through a bunker aperture to kill or suppress the crew, then following up with shaped charge to collapse the structure and seal the position. He taught other men in the platoon his techniques, creating a distributed capability so that bunker busting wasn't dependent on a single specialist. Kowalski formalized it, designating 3 grenadiers per platoon and establishing doctrine for their employment, positioning them to support assaults, providing security while they reloaded, ensuring ammunition resupply was prioritized. The innovation spread across the regiment, then the division, as units shared hard-won knowledge about what worked and what got men killed. By the 3rd week of fighting, rifle grenades had become integral to Marine Corps tactics on Polilliu, not a novelty or specialized weapon, but a standard tool carried by riflemen and employed as routinely as machine guns or mortars. The Japanese adapted, but slowly and at terrible cost. They began reinforcing bunker apertures with additional layers of log and coral, creating baffles that deflected grenades before they could penetrate interior spaces. They dug positions deeper, with multiple chambers connected by right-angle turns that contained blast effects and prevented a single grenade from killing entire crews. They positioned observers to watch for grenadiers and assigned marksmen to target them specifically, recognizing that eliminating the men with launchers reduced the infantry's bunker-busting capability. But these countermeasures took time to implement and required materials that were increasingly scarce as the siege dragged on. Defenders were rationing ammunition, water, and medical supplies, living in caves that stank of excrement and decay, surrounded by wounded men who screamed through the night because morphine had run out weeks ago. American forces controlled the surface, the air, and the sea approaches. Resupply was impossible. Reinforcement wasn't coming. Every defensive position that fell was gone forever, and the rifle grenades were collapsing them faster than Japanese engineers could dig new ones. Nakagawa's defense plan had assumed that strong fortifications and fanatical determination would inflict casualties severe enough to make the Americans withdraw or negotiate. He hadn't accounted for a weapon that negated fortification advantages and allowed individual riflemen to destroy positions that should have required artillery or airstrikes. By October, Japanese radio intercepts showed increasing desperation, messages referring to the new explosive rifle and pleading for tactics to counter it. Intelligence officers noted that enemy resistance was collapsing faster in sectors where grenade-equipped infantry operated, compared to areas where traditional assault methods were still employed. Mitchell saw the psychological effect firsthand during patrol in late October. His squad was clearing a network of interconnected caves on the northern end of the pocket, moving cautiously through tunnels barely wide enough for a man in full gear. The darkness was absolute beyond their flashlight beams, and every junction was a potential ambush point. Standard procedure was to call out warnings, give defenders a chance to surrender, then toss grenades into any space that didn't respond. But grenades were in short supply. Requisitions couldn't keep pace with expenditure rates, and throwing them in confined tunnels risked collapsing passages or injure your own men with overpressure. Mitchell suggested an alternative. He loaded a grenade blank, fitted an M17 round, and positioned himself at a tunnel junction while the squad waited behind cover. He called out in a handful of Japanese phrases they'd been taught. Surrender. Come out. No harm. Silence. Then a voice from the darkness, shouting something rapid and angry. Mitchell aimed the Garand into the tunnel and fired. The grenade round streaked down the passage, trailing sparks from its fin scraping stone, and detonated 40 feet in with a blast that shook dust and ceiling, and sent a pressure wave rolling back that popped ears and made men stagger. When the smoke cleared, 3 Japanese soldiers emerged from a side chamber, hands raised, faces blackened with coral dust, and eyes wide with shock. They surrendered without resistance, and when interrogators questioned them later, all 3 described the same thing. They had heard the strange sound of a rifle, then the grenade round ricocheting off tunnel walls as it flew toward them, then the explosion that felt like the cave was collapsing. One man said he thought the Americans had invented a weapon that fired artillery shells from rifles. Another described it as the sound of death coming through the dark. They chose surrender over waiting for the next round. It was one of the few instances on Peleliu where Japanese troops gave up voluntarily, and interrogators attributed it directly to the psychological impact of the rifle grenades. The weapon wasn't perfect. Misfires happen when grenade blanks fail to generate sufficient pressure, leaving rounds stuck in a launcher or tumbling weakly downrange without detonating. The launcher itself was fragile, the rotating collar could crack under stress, and the spigot spring wore out after repeated use. Accuracy degraded beyond 150 yards, and even at optimal ranges, the rainbow trajectory made it difficult to hit small targets like bunker-firing ports. Wind affected the flight path unpredictably because the fin grenades had significant surface area relative to their mass. Hot barrels caused premature detonation of some early production rounds, killing at least 2 Marines before ordnance officers identified the problem and implemented stricter quality control. Grenadiers were vulnerable during the loading and firing sequence. The process took 10 to 15 seconds from start to launch, during which the shooter was exposed and focused on a weapon rather than incoming fire. Enemy snipers learned to target men carrying grenade bags, recognizing the distinctive canvas satchels, and understanding that killing a grenadier degraded the unit's offensive capability. Mitchell survived 3 near misses from sniper fire, 1 round passing close enough to tear his sleeve and leave powder burns on his arm. After that, he started loading grenades from covered positions and using other Marines to observe while he fired, reducing exposure time but requiring coordination that wasn't always possible in chaotic engagements. Despite these limitations, The rifle grenade proved itself repeatedly as the single most effective man-portable bunker-busting weapon in the Marine Corps inventory. More responsive than artillery, more versatile than flamethrowers, and lethal enough to force fortified defenders to abandon positions that should have taken days to reduce. By the time Peleliu was declared secure in late November, though Japanese holdouts would continue resisting for months, rifle grenades had destroyed an estimated 400 fortified positions and contributed to the reduction of hundreds more through suppressive fire and psychological impact. Casualty analyses showed that units equipped with multiple grenadiers suffered lower losses and advanced faster than those relying solely on traditional assault methods. After-action reports praised the weapon's effectiveness and recommended expanding grenade launcher issue to all rifle squads across the Pacific Theater. Ordnance production ramped up accordingly, and by early 1945, every Marine rifle squad hitting Iwo Jima and Okinawa included at least 2 trained grenadiers carrying M7 launchers and full loads of M9A1 and M17 rounds. The tactics pioneered on Peleliu became doctrine, disseminated through training bulletins and instructional films that showed proper employment techniques and common mistakes to avoid. Mitchell's methods: firing from defilade, sequencing different grenade types, coordinating with squad movements, appeared in tactical manuals almost verbatim, though his name was never mentioned. The Corps didn't celebrate individual innovation the way some services did. Credit went to units and commanders, not enlisted men who figure out how to kill more effectively. Mitchell himself never made it off Peleliu. On November 24th, during one of the final clearing operations in the northern caves, his squad encountered a bypass bunker complex that intelligence had marked as neutralized. They were moving through what should have been secured territory when machine gun fire erupted from a concealed position, catching them in a narrow defile with no cover. Mitchell, carrying his grenade rifle as always, tried to return fire but took multiple hits before he could even unsling the weapon. Kowalski dragged into cover while the rest of the squad laid suppressing fire, but Mitchell was unconscious from blood loss and shock. Corpsmen worked on him for 15 minutes, packing wounds and trying to stabilize him for evacuation. But the damage was too extensive. He died on the litter before they reached the aid station, still wearing the canvas grenade bag across his chest and the M7 launcher clipped to his Garand. He was buried in the division cemetery on Peleliu's southern end, along with over 1,000 other Marines who never left the island. The regiment put him in for a Silver Star based on Kowalski's recommendation. The citation detailed 11 confirmed bunker kills and numerous enemy casualties attributable to his accurate grenade fire, but the medal was downgraded to a Bronze Star somewhere in the approval process, and his family received it in the mail 6 months later, with a form letter expressing the nation's gratitude. His younger sister kept it in a dresser drawer for the rest of her life, but never displayed it. The story hurt too much to revisit, and after the war nobody wanted to hear about rifle grenades and bunker fighting and men burned alive by shape charges. They wanted to move on, forget, rebuild. The rifle grenade itself had a longer legacy, though its prominence faded as new weapons filled the bunker-busting role. The M1 Garand served through Korea, where grenade launchers saw renewed use against Chinese fortifications in the mountains, but by Vietnam the M14 and M16 were replacing it, and the M79 grenade launcher, a dedicated weapon rather than a rifle attachment, offered better accuracy and faster reloading. The M203 grenade launcher, mounted on the barrel of an M16, became the standard by the 1970s, and rifle grenades faded from U.S. military use entirely. Other nations continued using them. France, Israel, and various Eastern European countries maintained rifle grenade capability into the 21st century, but American doctrine moved toward dedicated launchers and shoulder-fired rockets. The reasons were practical. Rifle grenades required switching ammunition types, which slowed response time and increased the chance of accidentally firing a ball around with the launcher attached, an error that could destroy the rifle or injure the shooter. Dedicated launchers eliminated that risk and allowed grenadiers to engage targets without rendering their primary weapon temporarily useless. But in the brutal island-hopping campaigns of 1944 and 1945, when Marines needed immediate bunker-busting capability and couldn't wait for specialized weapons to be designed and fielded, the rifle grenade was exactly what the situation demanded. It was improvised innovation turned into standardized doctrine, a field-expedient solution that saved lives and won battles during the worst close-quarters fighting of the Pacific War. Japanese veterans who survived the war and spoke about their experiences decades later remembered the rifle grenades vividly. One former sergeant, interviewed in the 1980s, described them as the weapon that made us fear our own bunkers. He recalled the sound to launch, a muffled thump unlike any other weapon, and the impossibly fast arrival of the explosive round. You couldn't track it, he said. By the time you heard the launch, it was already too late to react. And if it came through the firing port, everyone inside died. We started abandoning bunkers after the first round hit nearby, because we knew more were coming and staying inside meant certain death. Another veteran, who fought on Okinawa, said the rifle grenades were more feared than flamethrowers because they struck without warning from distances where defenders couldn't see the American positions. Flamethrowers you could hear and see coming. You could retreat into deeper tunnels or shoot the man carrying the fuel tanks. But the rifle grenades came from invisible positions, and there was no defense except leaving the fortification, which made you a target for regular rifle fire. It was psychological torture. These accounts, recorded long after the war when veterans felt safe discussing their experiences honestly, reveal the weapon's true impact. It wasn't just the physical destruction of bunkers or the casualties inflicted. It was the erosion of confidence in fortifications, the realization that concrete and coral couldn't protect you, that American riflemen could reach inside your defenses and kill you without exposing themselves to close-range counterfire. That psychological effect multiplied the weapon's tactical value far beyond its technical specifications. The rifle grenade also influenced post-war weapon development in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The success of man-portable, infantry-level bunker-busting weapons validated the concept of giving small units organic firepower rather than relying on supporting arms that require coordination and time to employ. This philosophy informed the development of recoilless rifles, rocket launchers, and eventually guided missiles that individual soldiers or small teams could operate. The Marine Corps took lessons from Peleliu and Okinawa and applied them to doctrine for assaulting fortified positions, emphasizing speed, violence, and overwhelming the defender's ability to react rather than grinding attrition tactics. The value of precision-delivered explosives at platoon and squad level became axiomatic, driving procurement decisions and tactical training for decades. In a sense, the rifle grenade was a conceptual ancestor of weapons like the M72 Law, the F4, and the Javelin, man-portable systems that give infantry units capability to destroy hardened targets without waiting for artillery or air support. The technology changed, but the principle remained. Give a rifleman a weapon that lets him kill enemies hiding behind cover they thought was impregnable, and you fundamentally alter the calculus of defensive warfare. By 1946, with the war over and demobilization underway, rifle grenades largely disappeared from training and conversation. The men who used them returned to civilian life and didn't talk much about what they'd done, because nobody wanted to hear stories about burning Japanese soldiers alive or watching men die screaming in bunkers. The weapons themselves were surplused, crated and stored in depots where most eventually rusted into scrap. The M7 launcher, which had been manufactured by the tens of thousands, became a collector's curiosity. Old veterans sometimes kept them as mementos, but they rarely discussed what the devices had been used for. The grenades themselves were demilitarized and destroyed because storing live explosives was expensive and dangerous. Within a decade, the rifle grenade was largely forgotten, except by military historians and veterans who remembered how essential it had been when bunkers seemed invincible and casualties were mounting daily. Modern accounts of Pacific Island fighting mention the weapon in passing, if at all, focusing instead on flamethrowers and tanks and artillery, the dramatic, visible tools of combat that photograph well and fit narrative conventions about industrial-age warfare. But for the men who fought in the ridges and caves, who spent weeks or months reducing fortifications one bunker at a time, the rifle grenade was salvation. It was a weapon that turned rifle squads into bunker-busting teams, that allowed small units to continue advancing when supporting fires were unavailable or ineffective, that made Japanese defenders abandon positions they'd spent months constructing. The story of the rifle grenade is also the story of institutional learning under pressure, how military organizations identify problems in combat and developed solutions faster than peacetime bureaucracies could ever manage. The need for bunker-busting capability was identified within weeks of the Guadalcanal landings. Field-expedient solutions appeared almost immediately as soldiers and Marines improvised launchers from scrap materials and learned to fire grenades using blank cartridges. The Army and Marine Corps formalized these innovations into standardized equipment within 18 months, a procurement cycle that would be considered impossibly fast in modern defense acquisition. The key was necessity. Lives depended on solving the bunker problem quickly, and officers at every level were willing to bypass normal channels and push experimental weapons into production based on preliminary testing and combat reports. The M7 launcher wasn't perfect when it was standardized. It had flaws that would be corrected in subsequent versions, and the grenade rounds themselves went through multiple iterations as ordnance engineers learned what worked and what failed in combat conditions. But it was good enough to make a difference, and that mattered more than achieving perfection. The willingness to field 80% solutions immediately rather than waiting for 95% solutions eventually is a lesson that modern military organizations often struggle to relearn. The rifle grenade wasn't the best possible bunker-busting weapon, but was available when it was needed, and it saved lives and won battles during the critical campaigns of 1944 and 1945. That's the measure of success that mattered to the men who used it. There's a photograph from Okinawa, taken in May 1945, that captures the essence of the rifle grenade's impact. It shows a Marine rifleman kneeling in a muddy shell crater, M1 Garand propped against his knee, with an M7 launcher attached and a grenade loaded. His face is exhausted, eyes hollow, stubble thick, uniform filthy with coral dust and dried blood. In the background, smoke rises from a bunker that's just been hit, flames visible through the firing port. The Marine is loading another grenade, hands moving through the sequence automatically, not even looking at the weapon because he's done it so many times the motion is muscle memory. The photo was taken by a combat correspondent and appeared in Leatherneck magazine with a caption about Marines employing rifle grenades against enemy fortifications. But it never became iconic the way some more photographs did. It was too technical, too specific, lacking the dramatic composition or emotional punch that made images famous. But for the men who fought in the Pacific, who know what it meant to face bunkers that couldn't be flanked or suppressed or bypassed, the photograph tells a complete story. It shows a man using a weapon that works, that gives him agency in a situation where otherwise he'd be pinned down waiting for artillery or air support that might not arrive in time. It shows the democratization of firepower, an infantryman with a tool that makes him as effective against fortifications as a tank or howitzer crew. And it shows exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of men who've been fighting for weeks through terrain that favor defenders at every turn, using innovation and determination to overcome material disadvantages. Corporal Danny Mitchell never saw that photograph, never knew how widely the techniques he pioneered would spread across the Pacific theater. He died believing his innovations were minor tactical adjustments, useful for his squad and platoon, but nothing that would reshape doctrine or be remembered after the war. He didn't know that after-action reports from Paliliu specifically cited grenade rifle employment as a key factor in reducing casualties and maintaining offensive momentum through the Umurbagal fighting. He didn't know that training films would incorporate his methods or that manuals would codify his tactics. He didn't know that 2 months after his death, Marines hitting the beach at Iwo Jima would carry M7 launchers as standard equipment and use them exactly the way he taught his squad to use them. He just knew that the weapon worked, that it gave him a way to protect his friends and accomplish the mission without suicidal heroics. That was enough for the men who followed, who carried rifle grenades through Iwo and Okinawa and a dozen other brutal fights. Mitchell's legacy lived on in techniques and tactics they inherited without knowing their origin. The knowledge passed from veteran to replacement, squad leader to fire team, written in blood and fire rather than printed in manuals. And though his name disappeared from official records and nobody remembers who first figured out how to use rifle grenades effectively in cave fighting, the impact of his innovation helped end the war and bring men home who otherwise would have died taking bunkers the hard way. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. The rifle grenade remains a footnote in military history, a specialized weapon that served a critical role during a specific period and then faded as technology advanced. But for a few years, in the worst fighting of the Pacific War, it was the skullcracker that turned fortifications into tombs and gave American infantry the edge they needed against defenders who perfected the art of defensive warfare. The men who used it didn't fight for glory or recognition. They fought because their country asked them to, because their friends were dying, because the mission required someone to step forward and take the risk. Many of them didn't come home. Most who survived never talked about what they'd done, carrying memories that were too painful or too complicated to share with people who hadn't been there. But their innovation mattered. It saved lives, won battles, and shortened a war that might otherwise have dragged on for years. That's the real legacy of the rifle grenade. Not the weapon itself, but the men who used it and the difference they made when it counted most. They were ordinary soldiers handed an extraordinary challenge, and they found a way to meet it. In the end, that's the story that deserves to be remembered